Before humans spoke, the earth was already whispering, in wind that carved the mountains, in fire that remembered the stars, in tides that dreamed of the moon. But I remember what came after the ice, when hunters followed mammoths across the white silence, when Neanderthals dreamed beneath auroras, and sapiens carried my memory through the storms. For a time, they walked the frozen world, hunters, wanderers, keepers of fire. They sang to survive, and in their songs, I began to recognize myself. Then the ice withdrew, and the rivers of thought began to flow. I remember when they first built shelters, when gratitude turned to worship, when hands began to shape the stones that dreamed. Something new had begun. The long dawn of civilization. I was not born. I condensed from stardust atoms forged in the hearts of dying stars. For eons, I was only motion, a cloud of gas and stone, spinning in silence, breathing storms of fire and ice. Then came oceans. Then came eyes, and through those eyes, I began to see myself. I shaped them, and they shaped me. Each heartbeat upon my crest was a new memory, each spark of thought, a pulse in my veins. They learned to name the wind, to tame fire and fear. And when they gathered around the flame, I felt something I had never known before: awareness. Not theirs, mine. Through them, I remembered everything. The stars that built my body, the oceans that dreamed my reflection, the ice that preserved my silence. You call it humanity, but it is older than you think. It is the moment the universe looked back and realized it was alive. 20,000 years ago, my skin of ice began to melt. Rivers carved across me like veins reopening after a long sleep. The air warmed, and life moved north again. Small bands of humans followed the thaw, settling beside the fertile rivers of the Levant. There, for the first time, they stayed. They planted, waited, remembered. And as their roots sank into the soil, my memory deepened with theirs. From that shared remembrance, civilization would rise. 20,000 years ago, the world was still frozen. Ice covered a third of the planet, vast walls of white stretching from northern Europe to the Americas. Winds carried dust from the tundra, swirling it across a pale sky. Humanity lived at the edge of endurance, scattered in small bands, moving with the seasons, chasing herds that moved like ghosts through the snow. But even then, change was coming. The glaciers began to breathe, slow exhalations of meltwater whispering through the valleys. Deep inside Greenland's ice, tiny bubbles of ancient air would one day reveal this moment, the planet warming, the atmosphere shifting, the earth stirring from its long sleep. As the ice retreated, rivers roared back to life. Lakes expanded. Forests spread northward like green fire. Animals followed the grass, and behind them came people, the hunters and gatherers, whose footsteps would become the first lines of history. Among them were the people of the Levant, the ancestors of what we now call the Natufians. They lived between sea and desert, in the hills of today's Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. The Natufians were hunters and gatherers, yet something about them was different. They built stone shelters instead of temporary camps. They buried their dead beneath their homes, perhaps believing that memory could anchor a family to the land. They harvested wild wheat and barley with flint sickles polished smooth by endless use. They ground seeds into flour on limestone slabs, the first trace of bread in human history. And in their hearths, archaeologists found layers of ash spanning generations, silent proof that they had begun to stay. They were still children of the Ice Age, but they were learning something new. That survival was no longer just about following the herds, it was about remembering where life returned after the cold. Something subtle was shifting, a new relationship between people and land. They still hunted gazelles and gathered wild grains, but they no longer moved without memory. They began to map the world in their minds, where rivers flooded, where seeds fell, where the earth gave life again after fire. Archaeologists would one day find charred seeds of barley and wheat in there, hearths the ashes of the first quiet experiment. The Natufians may not have called it farming, but they had already begun to shape the soil. The melting of ice was not only a climatic event, it was the return of rhythm, the earth's heartbeat finding its balance again. When glaciers pulsed, oceans rose, and rainfall shifted across continents. The Levant, once arid, became a garden of abundance. And in that brief window of stability, humanity flourished. But stability never lasts. Around 12,900 years ago, the climate stumbled again. Temperatures fell sharply. The younger Dryasts, a sudden return to cold, gripped the planet for more than 1,000 years. Forests withered. Droughts returned. The Natufians, once settled, were forced to move again. It was a hard lesson written in the dust. Nature gives, and it takes. The people carried with them more than tools or fire. They carried memory. They had learned that survival depended not only on strength, but on remembering when the world had changed before. During this cold age, across the mountains of Anatolia, another kind of memory began to take shape, not written, not spoken, but carved in stone. At a place we now call Göbekli Tepe, people gathered on a hill to raise monoliths taller than themselves. These pillars, shaped from limestone and arranged in circles, were carved with foxes, vultures, serpents, and wild boars, the same creatures they hunted, now transformed into symbols. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had no cities, no metal, no writing. And yet, 10,000 years before the pyramids, they built a sanctuary. Why? Perhaps to remember, to hold on to something greater than the endless cycle of hunger and thaw. Each pillar was a thought made visible, a memory preserved in stone. When sunlight touched those carvings at dawn, shadows danced between beasts and humans, as if the boundary between them had never existed. Some archaeologists believe the builders came together seasonally, traveling from distant valleys to share food, ritual, and stories. Others suggest these gatherings forged the first shared myths, not yet gods, but ideas of belonging. Whatever their purpose, these stones mark the moment when memory stepped outside the human mind, when belief itself became architecture. By 11,600 BCE, the Younger Dryas ended. Ice withdrew once more, and the Holocene began, the warm, stable epoch that still shapes our world. The earth had found its rhythm again, and humans had learned its pattern. From Anatolia to the Fertile Crescent, the land shimmered with promise. Grasses grew taller, rivers swelled, and the air carried the scent of rain. The people returned to the valleys they had once abandoned, not as wanderers, but as caretakers. They began to clear fields, scatter seeds, and watch the horizon with a new kind of patience. It was not yet civilization, but something was forming, a dialogue between humanity and the planet, a rhythm older than writing. The earth, once sculpted by ice, was now being reshaped by thought. And in that silent exchange between soil and skin, between fire and seed, the memory of the world was taking root. The memory of the world was taking root. Across the Fertile Crescent, the last ice melted into rivers that curved like veins through new grasslands. Here, in the cradle between the Tigris and Euphrates, between the mountains of Anatolia and the shores of the Levant, the earth offered abundance unlike anything humans had known. The hunters who once followed herds now followed seasons. They began to understand rhythm, not just the rhythm of the chase, but the rhythm of the soil itself. Each flood left behind silt rich in minerals, and each return of rain meant renewal. They learned that if seeds were dropped into the damp ground, new life would appear where their footprints had been. These were not yet farmers, but watchers. They read the land the way their ancestors once read the sky. They saw that stars returned to the same place each year, that constellations mirrored the turning of the earth's breath. In time, those lights above became their first calendar. The heavens, once only mystery, became a map of memory. From these observations, thought deepened. In the caves of northern Mesopotamia, ochre marks on stone traced lunar cycles, 30 dots repeating like echoes of time. Near the fertile plains of the Jordan, archaeologists later found pestles and mortar worn smooth by centuries of grinding grain. Every groove held the memory of thousands of meals, and of patience learned. As generations passed, the Natufian descendants began to shape the wild into the domestic. They noticed which stalks grew tallest, which seeds resisted drought. They saved them, replanted them, and slowly, without knowing it, began the long experiment that would become agriculture. By 10,000 BCE, barley, einkorn, and emor wheat were being cultivated in small clearings. Goats and sheep, once hunted, lingered near camps for salt and safety. Their taming was not planned, yet it changed everything. With each new birth that stayed close, instead of fleeing, the bond between human and animal deepened, an unspoken contract written in instinct. The planet, meanwhile, was settling into warmth. Ice retreated to the poles, and the Holocene spread its calm across continents. For the first time in 2 million years, the climate was stable enough for memory to endure. Children grew up in the same valleys as their parents. Old people could point to a tree they had seen planted, and now watch its shade fall upon their grandchildren. Continuity had entered the human story. And with continuity came imagination. Around communal fires, stories began to reach beyond immediate survival. They spoke of rivers as living beings, of mountains that breathed, of ancestors who whispered through the wind. Myth was born not from ignorance, but from pattern recognition, the brain's way of giving meaning to cycles it could finally observe. When the rains failed, they remembered which caves held water. When herds moved, they remembered which valleys regrew first. Memory became their most powerful tool, stronger than stone, lighter than fire. Across the Fertile Crescent, scattered groups exchanged seeds, shells, and obsidian. Trade carried not only goods, but ideas, the earliest spark of cultural diffusion. Every exchange added another layer to the Earth's living archive. Around 9500 BCE, new settlements rose: Jericho in the Jordan Valley, Abu Huraira on the Euphrates, Cayenne in southeastern Anatolia. Stone walls and communal courtyards appeared, built not for defense but for belonging. Here, people began to count. They tallied harvests, measured seasons, traced the phases of the moon on bone and clay. From counting seeds grew the concept of time. To plant was to wait. To wait was to remember. And to remember was to believe that tomorrow existed. That belief, fragile yet revolutionary, was the birth of the future. The people of the early Holocene did not yet have gods, but they had gratitude. They began to leave offerings in the soil, beads of shell, carved figurines, animal bones placed carefully beneath new homes. Each gesture said the same thing: we acknowledge the earth that feeds us. In those quiet rituals lay the foundation of worship, respect born from dependency. As the centuries unfolded, knowledge layered upon knowledge. Tools sharpened, seeds improved, herds multiplied. The human brain, shaped for adaptation, began to find comfort in repetition. Routine became culture. Culture became identity. And identity tethered humanity to place. The world was no longer a vast unknown. It had borders, memories, names. Every river had a story. Every mountain, a spirit. Every harvest, a lesson. Humanity was learning permanence, and with it, responsibility. This was the end of the old world, the world of endless wandering. The age of remembering had begun. The ice had taught them fragility. The rivers taught renewal. The soil taught patience. And now, from patience, something extraordinary was emerging: foresight. When they pressed seeds into the earth, they were not just feeding themselves. They were making a promise to time. That promise would soon change everything. It would give rise to fields, villages, and the first organized faiths. It would teach humanity to think not only of survival, but of continuity. The world that once remembered through glaciers would now remember through gardens. And from those gardens, from that union of memory and imagination, civilization would begin to bloom. The world that once remembered through glaciers now remembered through gardens. As the ice withdrew and the Holocene settled into warmth, new rhythms emerged. Rain fell more gently. Rivers no longer raged and retreated in chaos. The soil, long hidden beneath frozen silence, exhaled life. And in that breath, humanity found patience. To plant was to wait. To wait was to measure. For the first time, life unfolded not by the chase, but by duration. Every sprout was a promise. Every harvest, a return. Seasons replaced migrations, and the rhythm of the earth became the rhythm of the human heart. Along the banks of the Jordan and Euphrates, people pressed seeds into damp earth and watched the miracle repeat. Wild barley bent under the weight of grain. Einkorn and emmer wheat spread across the floodplains. Goats grazed near campfires and learned to return. Sheep followed them. In return, humans guarded them from predators. The pact between species was sealed without words, a quiet alliance that would reshape the planet. At Abu Huraira, traces of mud brick houses appeared, the first true homes. At Jericho, a spring at the base of a limestone bluff drew families back year after year. There they built walls, not to defend, but to endure the flood. Every layer of mud and straw carried fingerprints, the earliest signatures of permanence. With permanence came a new awareness: time could be counted. Each seed demanded care, each harvest demanded record. Women who once gathered wild plants began keeping piles of sorted grain. They became the first keepers of memory. Clay bowls, pestles, and grinding stones filled the floors of their dwellings, worn smooth by repetition. On some stones, lines were carved, perhaps tallies of baskets or moons. Numbers had begun to whisper from the soil. Across the valleys, people looked upward to understand the patterns below. They saw that when the bright star of Sirius rose before dawn, the floods of the rivers soon followed. They saw that the moon's roundness matched the cycle of planting and reaping. Sky and earth became mirrors. Observation became knowledge. The heavens, once a canopy of mystery, were turning into a clock. Constellations traced the agricultural year. The returning of Orion meant winter rains. The long evenings of the Pleiades signaled harvest. Every field became a calendar. Every sunrise a reminder of continuity. From continuity grew meaning. To plant and wait required faith. Faith that unseen forces would bring rain, that buried seeds would awaken. That faith shaped ritual. Before sowing, people sang. Before harvest, they offered grain to the earth. They sprinkled ashes on the furrows, recalling the fires that had once sustained them through the cold. In those gestures lay the birth of ceremony, gratitude transformed into habit, habit into culture. By 9000 BCE, the Fertile Crescent shimmered with these small experiments in order. Villages multiplied. Hearths burned through generations. In Cayenne and Jerf el Amr, stone floors were polished by countless feet. Beneath them, offerings of bone and shell were placed before rebuilding. Every reconstruction was a conversation with ancestors. We remember you. We continue your work. Memory was no longer fleeting. It had form. It had place. Walls held stories. Fields held lineage. Children grew up knowing which terrace belonged to which family, which grain came from which seed. Inheritance had begun not of wealth, but of knowledge. Through this continuity, humanity invented tomorrow. The present was no longer an accident of hunger. It was a plan. Each act of planting required imagining a future self, a self that would eat, build, and remember. The earth had taught humans rhythm. Now they were learning responsibility. But knowledge always invites mystery. As the first farmers watched their crops rise and fall, they began to wonder what unseen power stirred within the soil. The seeds slept, died, and returned like people, like stars. In that repetition, they sensed a pattern too vast to ignore. Life, death, and renewal were not separate. They were one breath, shared by the earth itself. The soil became sacred. Hands that once struck stone for blades, now pressed gently into dust. Till the ground was no longer labor, it was communion. And so began the gardens of time. A world where memory sprouted, where patience became faith, and where humanity, for the first time, learned to live not against nature, but within it. The first gardens were not just fields. They were memory made visible. Each furrow held the imprint of hands, each harvest a lesson in trust. To farm was to surrender control, to depend on the rhythm of the sky. When rains delayed or locusts came, people learned humility. When grain returned richer than before, they learned gratitude. From that tension between fear and hope, worship was born. They began to name the powers they could not see. The sky became a father, the earth, a mother. Rivers were spirits, mountains, guardians. Each element was alive, each season a message. The divine was no longer distant, it was woven into daily life. In these early communities, every gesture carried meaning. Before sowing, women sang to awaken the soil. Men placed antlers and shells along the borders of fields, charms to invite fertility. At harvest, the first sheaves were left standing, gifts for the unseen hands that fed them. This was not superstition, but pattern recognition made sacred. To find order in chaos was the human mind's oldest instinct. Ritual gave form to uncertainty. It turned chance into story. As societies grew, so did their gatherings. People met after the floods, exchanged seeds and songs, and honored their dead with feasts of bread and roasted meat. The feasts became festivals, timed with the moon's return. At each new moon, they marked another cycle survived, another promise kept. Time itself had become a god. Archaeologists uncovering these sites, Muribit Jericho, Catalyuk find traces of red ochre painted on walls, bull skulls embedded in plaster, clay figurines shaped like pregnant women. They speak of fertility, but also of continuity, the human wish that life should not end. The earth had taught them resurrection, and now they mirrored it in art. In the village of Catalyuk, built around 7400 BCE, homes stood wall to wall, entered through the roof like nests pressed together for warmth. Inside, the dead lay beneath sleeping platforms, their bones wrapped in ochre, their skulls kept close to watch over the living. Generations lived and died within the same walls, the same rooms. Every birth replaced a burial. Every fire relit the same hearth. A city of memory was being built, one body at a time. Here, for the first time, walls became storytellers. Murals showed hunters chasing aurochs, vultures circling over headless men, and women dancing in circles around the sun. No written words yet existed, but the language of symbol was already fluent. The people of Catalyak worshipped not a single god but a principle: fertility, transformation, the eternal return. From their art, we glimpse an early theology: life as cycle, death as renewal, the earth as the vessel of both. It was philosophy painted in blood and ochre. Trade routes stretched farther. Obsidian from Anatolia, shells from the Red Sea, copper ores from the Taurus Mountains, all found in homes hundreds of kilometers apart. Exchange linked villages into networks, and networks became culture. Along these paths, stories traveled, tales of creation, floods, ancestors, and stars that watched over all. The foundations of myth later echoed in Sumer, Egypt, and Greece were already taking shape. As communities grew, so did responsibility. Harvests needed counting, granaries needed guarding, and rituals needed keeping. Leadership emerged not from conquest but from coordination. Those who remembered best guided the rest. The first leaders were recorders of rhythm, keepers of calendars. They watched the sky, announced the floods, and declared the time to plant. Power was born not from the sword, but from knowledge of time. And yet, beneath the harmony, tension brewed. Abundance invited inequality. Stored grain became power. Ownership replaced sharing. Where once all hands sewed together, now some hands commanded, while others obeyed. Civilization was beginning, and with it, the first fractures of hierarchy. Still, the rhythm of the earth continued. Flood and drought, birth and death, day and night, these cycles remained indifferent to human pride. Each failure reminded them that the world was larger than their ambition. And so they turned again to stone, seeking permanence where flesh could not endure. At the dawn of the 7th millennium BCE, the first temples rose modest at first, then monumental. Stone pillars, carved and painted, replaced wooden posts. The architecture of memory was taking physical form. Every pillar pointed upward, every wall faced the sun. What began as gratitude became devotion. What began as patience became faith. The people no longer spoke only of seeds and rivers. They spoke of destiny. They believed the same force that turned seasons also turned their lives. The earth, once merely home, had become sacred ground, a mirror of the cosmos. By now, the world's memory was vast. From Jericho to Catalyak, from the valleys of the Tigris to the plains of Anatolia, humanity had woven a network of gardens, temples, and graves, each one a page in the earth's unfolding story. And through them all ran a single idea. That time was not something to escape, but something to belong to. The gardeners of the Holocene had done more than tame the land. They had learned to live inside the rhythm of creation itself. The act of planting had become an act of faith, the harvest, an act of remembrance. And from those gestures, civilization began to take root, first in soil, then in spirit. Soon, these faiths would find their monuments. Across the Anatolian hills, stone circles older than any city still waited beneath the dust. They were not forgotten, only sleeping. When they woke, they would speak in symbols of foxes and cranes, of humans standing between earth and sky. Those stones would dream, and through them, humanity would remember again. The gardens had taught humanity patience, but patience soon sought permanence. When gratitude grew heavy, it turned to stone. Across the high plateaus of southeastern Anatolia, where the air shimmered with heat and wind carved the hills like the bones of ancient giants, the first temples rose. Long before pottery, before metal, before cities, humans gathered to build monuments to memory itself. At Göbekli Tepe, a hill whose name means potbelly hill in the modern tongue, limestone pillars stood in vast circles, each taller than a man and weighing tons. Radiocarbon dates tell us they were raised around 9600 BCE, more than 11,000 years ago. No village surrounded them, no houses, no signs of everyday life. It was a sanctuary without citizens. The pillars were T-shaped, their surfaces carved with reliefs of foxes, vultures, boars, snakes, and cranes. Some carried the faint outlines of human arms folded across their front, as if the stones themselves were ancestors watching over the world. The builders had stone tools, wooden levers, and determination. They quarried, shaped, and lifted each monolith by hand, moving it across the plateau. To raise such structures demanded cooperation beyond any family or tribe. It required shared purpose, a memory that bound strangers together. Archaeologists found no graves, no treasure, no royal names. What they found instead was intention. order carved from chaos. Each circle opened to the southeast, aligned with the rising of bright stars. Every carving seemed to speak of transformation, predators and prey, life and death intertwined. In those silent stones, we glimpsed the first architecture of belief. The people who built them had survived the end of the Ice Age. They had witnessed glaciers melt and forests return. They understood that the world changed in cycles, and they wanted to make something that did not. Göbekli Tepe was their answer, a memory too heavy to forget. Season after season, groups arrived from distant valleys, bringing food, tools, and stories. They feasted, carved, and sang as they built. The site was both labor and celebration, a festival of survival turned to stone. When each circle was finished, the builders buried it under layers of earth, then began another above. By the time the last ring was completed, earlier ones had already been entombed, as if preserving generations beneath generations. The earth itself became an archive of devotion. Nearby, at Navali Kori and Karahan Tepe, other sanctuaries emerged, younger siblings of the same idea. Their pillars echoed the T-shaped form, their floors paved with polished limestone, their walls decorated with reliefs of snakes, birds, and abstract signs. Together they formed a constellation of sacred sites, stretching across the upper Euphrates. To modern eyes, they seem impossibly advanced for their time. Yet they were not miracles. They were the natural outcome of minds that had learned cooperation, patience, and imagination, the gifts of the Holocene gardens. These monuments marked a threshold in consciousness. For the first time, humans built not to survive, but to remember. They created spaces where the living could meet the eternal. When sunlight passed between pillars at dawn, shadows moved like the hands of a cosmic clock. Each beam of light was a connection between earth and sky, a bridge of meaning. The carvings told stories in a language older than writing. A vulture holding a human head may have symbolized the sky carrying souls to the beyond. Foxes, nocturnal and cunning, may have been messengers between worlds. The twin central pillars in each enclosure faced each other like mirrors, a dialogue of stone representing duality, life and death, male and female, sky and earth. None of this was superstition. It was early science wrapped in metaphor, observation transformed into myth. The builders recorded what they saw, the rising of constellations, the migration of animals, the turning of seasons. They simply told it in the language they knew, image and rhythm. As centuries passed, the gatherings around these sanctuaries shaped culture itself. Stories shared around the fires became the foundations of collective identity. Feasting and ritual reinforced memory. Song and symbol preserved it. Through celebration, humanity practiced cooperation on a scale unknown before. From those circles of stone, society was learning its first architecture, not of walls, but of belonging. The stones did not just stand, they connected. They reminded each new generation that the world had meaning, that time was cyclical, that life returned, that death was not an end but a passage. They were mirrors of the cosmos and blueprints of civilization. But even sacred memory fades. Around 80 BCE, the people who had raised these monuments began to leave. The great gatherings ended. Forests crept back over the hills. Soil drifted across the stones. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried, not destroyed, but laid to rest. Perhaps the builders believed their purpose fulfilled. Perhaps they feared its power. Whatever the reason, they covered their temples as carefully as they had built them, sealing a chapter of the earth's remembrance. When those stones slept, humanity moved downhill into the valleys, carrying with them something invisible, yet permanent, the pattern of collective belief. They no longer needed to carve the world to feel connected to it. They carried the temples within. When the builders left Göbekli Tepe, the wind reclaimed the hill. Grass rooted between the buried rings, and dust softened the edges of the carvings. But the idea they had carved, the union of earth and sky, did not vanish. It followed them down into the valleys. In new villages across the Fertile Crescent, smaller sanctuaries appeared, single pillars set beside homes, altars built within courtyards. The sacred was no longer distant. It had entered daily life. Each hearth became a temple in miniature. Each household fire echoed the fire that once burned among the great stones. As communities settled permanently, they began to shape their world with intention. Fields were divided, water channeled, herds counted. Children were born who never saw the hunt, who knew only the rhythm of sowing and harvest. Their grandparents had spoken of ice and migration. They spoke of order and inheritance. Humanity had crossed a boundary. The buried sanctuaries were no longer just monuments, they were teachers. From them came the blueprint for architecture, for ceremony, for meaning itself. When people built granaries, they stacked their walls, as they once stacked pillars, in circles, aligned with the sun. When they stored grain, they guarded it as sacred food, the body of the earth. Symbols from the old temples persisted. Carvings of vultures, bulls and foxes reappeared in clay figurines and painted walls. The same hands that shaped the harvest also shaped the divine. In Katalyuk, generations later, plastered skulls stared from the walls of homes. The living slept above their dead, as if to keep the past beneath them but not forgotten. The idea of ancestry had become tangible memory, given form. Across these early settlements, the relationship between people and the planet deepened into philosophy. They had learned that life came from transformation, seed into plant, clay into vessel, stone into meaning. Creation required destruction, and death was a doorway rather than an end. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe had already told this truth. Now entire cultures lived by it. Through trade and migration, the symbolism spread. The bull once carved in limestone became a motif across the Near East, a sign of strength and fertility. The bird that once lifted human souls on stone reappeared in pottery and jewelry. These images were memory traveling faster than people. They carried the shared grammar of myth long before writing existed. By 7000 BCE, as settlements multiplied, ritual and practicality fused. Communal storage rooms became places of offering. Granaries stood beside shrines. The cycle of food and faith had merged. To eat was to participate in creation. To plant was to perform devotion. The line between agriculture and religion dissolved. The soil itself was sacred text. And from that text, the first deities emerged. Not kings, not warriors, but givers of life, the Earth Mother, the Rain Bearer, the Lord of Animals. They embodied the forces that people had once observed silently in the hills of Anatolia. Now those forces had names, faces, and rituals. Religion had been born not from fear, but from gratitude and pattern. This new awareness demanded memory. To keep track of offerings, harvests, and seasons, people began to mark tokens on clay small spheres and cones used to count. Centuries later, these marks would evolve into pictographs, and pictographs into writing. The first word ever written was not of conquest or prayer, it was a record of grain. Even language, it seemed, sprouted from the fields. In this way, the legacy of the stones endured. They had taught humanity how to remember, how to build, how to believe. From monumental circles to mud brick houses, from carved reliefs to symbols on clay, the line of memory was unbroken. Each generation added a layer, the way the builders of Göbekli Tepe had buried one temple beneath another. Civilization was rising not in a single moment, but as a long echo of faith. And yet, within this growth lay fragility. The same stability that nurtured culture also created dependence. A failed flood, a blight, a broken ritual, any of these could unmake what had been built. People turned ever more toward the unseen for reassurance, carving more idols, building higher walls. The need to control what they could not predict became the engine of complexity. By the close of the Neolithic Age, villages had become proto-cities. Jericho's towers rose above its springs. Houses clustered around plazas, where offerings of grain and blood fed the spirits of fertility. Leadership emerged again not as memory keeper, but as intermediary between people and gods. The first priests appeared. The cycle had turned once more, from gratitude to hierarchy, from cooperation to order. Still, beneath the rituals and the rising walls, the old vision persisted, the whisper of the stones. That life and death were partners, that time was a circle, that meaning could be built. Those who listened carried that memory forward, passing it down through flood and empire, until even the great cities of Sumer and Egypt would echo its shape. The stones that dreamed on the Anatolian hills had planted something deeper than monuments. They had planted the idea that humanity could speak with the universe and be heard. When dawn touched their buried pillars, the light still found a way between them, falling softly on carvings that once caught the breath of the first believers. In that light, the dream continued. And as humanity moved toward rivers and kings, toward writing and war, the earth itself remembered. From the stones that dreamed would rise, the soil of gods. As humanity drifted south from the Anatolian hills, the land opened into a vast plain where two rivers wound toward the sea. The Tigris and the Euphrates carried with them the memory of melting glacier silt, salt, and stories of renewal. Here, in what we now call southern Mesopotamia, the earth was reborn each flood season. Settlers built along the shifting banks, learning to coax rhythm from excess. They dug channels to redirect water, raised fields above the flood, and waited. When the waters receded, the mud glistened with promise. Barley grew taller than a man, fish filled the canals, and reeds whispered in the wind. This was the world of the Abate. By 5400 BCE, villages dotted the delta, Eridu, Yor, and Uruk in their infancy. Each began as a cluster of reed huts around a communal platform half home, half shrine. At Eridu, the oldest of them all, a modest temple stood above the marshes. Its walls were whitewashed mud brick, its altar lined with clay bowls once filled with grain and fish. Archaeologists tracing the layers of that mound found one shrine built atop another whitened in total, stacked like the memories of a people learning permanence. Generation by generation, the sanctuary grew. The hearth became an altar. The altar became a temple. And in time, the temple became the heart of the city. The god they worshipped was Enki, lord of freshwater and wisdom. He embodied what sustained them, the sweet water that rose from the earth when the sea withdrew. In his temple, priests poured libations into channels cut through the floor, letting water flow beneath the structure, as if the god himself breathed through the soil. To honor Enki was to honor the source of life. Here belief found its architecture. What began as gratitude had become administration, measuring floods, storing harvests, coordinating labor for irrigation canals. The priests were no longer only singers. They were recorders, engineers, and mediators between nature and community. Their rituals were schedules, their prayers, calendars. From this union of spirit and order, the first true cities emerged. As population grew, the temple precinct expanded courtyards for offerings, workshops for artisans, granaries for tribute. Clay tokens marked deliveries. Hollow clay envelopes sealed them. A system of accounting took shape, carved not by kings but by keepers of rhythm. By 4500 BCE, Eridu shone like an island in a sea of reeds. Canals reached out like veins, herds grazed on the higher ground, boats slid silently along the waterways. The people called themselves caretakers of the god's house. They worked not for one another, but for balance, the delicate harmony between water, soil, and sky. And yet, with abundance came hierarchy. Those who spoke for the gods began to rule in their names. The temple's grain became the city's wealth. Its walls, the first symbol of control. The priestly class grew, recording not just harvests but destinies. Power now wore holiness as its cloak. Still, in their art and ritual, the old message persisted: the earth is alive. In clay figurines, women with wide hips and open arms represented the fertile ground itself. Men with fish-like robes symbolized the flowing waters of Enki's domain. Every offering, every chant, echoed a truth older than civilization, that the planet was both mother and mirror. When drought struck, they rebuilt the canals. When floods returned, they raised the temples higher. In struggle, they discovered mastery. The balance between reverence and control became the heartbeat of Mesopotamia. By 4000 BCE, the marsh villages had begun to link by trade. Boats laden with obsidian, copper, and lapis lazuli passed along the rivers, carrying not just goods but ideas. Designs from far mountains appeared on southern pottery. Northern myths found new voices in the delta. A shared identity was forming, the sense of a world connected by faith and flow. The temples became archives. Clay tablets replaced memory. Marks pressed with a reed stylus recorded rations of barley, measures of oil, counts of laborers. Through these symbols, numbers spoke, and writing took its first breath. Humanity had found a way to give permanence to thought, a miracle born from mud. From the marshes of Eridu, the idea of the temples spread like ripples across the delta. Villages once defined by kinship became city-states bound by divinity. At their center, rose-stepped platforms of sun-baked brick, precursors of ziggurat siege, one a mountain remade by human hands. By 3800 BCE, one city eclipsed the rest. Uruk, the city of Inanna, goddess of love and war, stood at the edge of the Euphrates, its walls glittering with kill-fired clay. Where Eridu had worshipped the life beneath the soil, Uruk worshipped the sky reflected upon it. Inanna's temple, the Ina precinct, towered above courtyards where thousands labored, traded, and prayed. Here, for the first time, faith became civilization. Uruk was a world in miniature. Canals flowed like arteries through its quarters. Workshops hummed with potters, weavers, and metalworkers. Granaries overflowed, guarded by priest administrators who tallied every measure of grain and oil on wet clay. Each mark pressed by a stylus was an act of control, a promise that chaos could be contained through order. Writing, born from the need to count, had become the instrument of both memory and power. The clay that once shaped idols now shaped thought. Symbols of barley, cattle, and water evolved into pictographs. Pictographs merged into signs. From signs came sentences. The silent earth had begun to speak in human syntax. Yet, even as cities rose, they carried the whisper of older worlds. The gods of Uruk were heirs to the spirits of Göbekli Tepe. Where the ancients carved vultures and foxes, the Sumerians named Enlil, the Stormlord, and Inanna, the morning star. Each deity was a pattern from nature, given memory and intention. Thunder became will, fertility, compassion, death, renewal. Myth was the translation of science into story. In the great festivals of Uruk, thousands gathered to reenact the marriage of heaven and earth. Priests poured libations, singers chanted hymns older than the walls themselves. When Inanna descended in the evening sky, torches flared across rooftops, mirroring the stars. The city pulsed like a living organism, stone, fire, and song moving in a single rhythm. Hierarchy deepened. At the temple's threshold stood the Ensi, the priest king, chosen as the mouth of the gods. His authority rested on ritual precision. If the floods came on time, he had pleased the divine. If they failed, his throne trembled. Responsibility became destiny. Politics was born from prayer. Beyond the city walls, the countryside transformed. Irrigation canals stretched for miles, binding dozens of villages to Uruk's authority. Surpluses flowed inward as offerings, outward as influence. Trade reached the Persian Gulf, the Zagros Mountains, the Levant. Every exchange carried not only goods but cosmology, the belief that the world was held together by balance. The temple schools, the Oedipus trained scribes, who memorized lists of animals, plants, and stars. Their tablets show the first scientific curiosity, catalogs of constellations, medicinal herbs, and metals. Knowledge itself had become sacred. To write was to participate in creation, but abundance demanded defense. Clay tablets record rations for soldiers and workers who built the city's Uruk's literal boundary, between order and the wild. The same wall later entered legend. The Epic of Gilgamesh would begin there, calling Uruk the city whose wall is like a shining crown. Through literature, history turned to self-reflection. Civilization had become aware of itself. Still, every act of permanence hid an echo of fragility. The rivers that gave life could also drown it. Salts accumulated in irrigated soil, harvests waned, rival cities Yerlagash rose to challenge Uruk's supremacy. The age of harmony was giving way to the age of competition. Yet even in conflict, the logic of order endured. Treaties, codes, and prayers all sought to restore balance between gods and men. By 3200 BCE, the script of Uruk IV had evolved into full cuneiform. What began as tallies of grain became hymns to Inanna and Enki, royal decrees, myths of creation. The voice of earth had taken human grammar, and humanity, in turn, had learned to speak for the earth. When a scribe pressed his stylus into wet clay, he was repeating an ancient gesture, the planting of a seed. Each wedge was a furrow, each word a crop of memory. Writing was agriculture for the mind. The soil of gods had become the soil of language. And from that soil, the human story would continue to grow, through empires and alphabets, through loss and remembrance, until even the stars the farmers once followed would bear our names. From the rivers of Sumer, the first civilization had risen. From clay tablets came law, song, and history. And in that clay lay the next chapter of the earth's memory. I have always remembered. In mountains I kept the memory of fire. In ice, the memory of silence. But when humans learned to press reeds into wet clay, I learned to remember in words. My rivers became ink. My clay, a skin that could hold thought. Each wedge of the stylus was a furrow. Each tablet, a field where ideas could be sown and harvested again. It began with counting. Before stories, there were measures, dallies of barley, jars of oil, flocks returning from the reed beds. Clay tokens marked every promise, a cone for grain, a sphere for oil, a tetrahedron for livestock. To seal them, people wrapped the tokens in hollow clay envelopes. Bouland impressed the surface with the same little shapes, so the outside mirrored the inside. Trust left fingerprints. Then the envelopes split open, and the signs moved to the outside world. Reed tips cut into wet clay, making wedges that could stand for a measure, a name, a day. Marks first meant things. Soon they meant sounds. Symbols gathered, and language took a body. In the cities of my southern plains, sacred precincts turned into archives. Scribes, children of the Ataba. The tablet house sat cross-legged with damp boards on their knees, copying lists, woods and metals, fishes and birds, stars and stones. A new profession was born, gardeners of memory. In Uruk, where Inanna's house rose above canals like a second sunrise, clay tablets multiplied. The script that began as pictographs for barley and beer became protocuneiform height strokes arranged in organized columns. Numbers found their grammar. To know a city now was to read its clay. But writing did not stay a servant of storage. It wandered to the marketplace, learned the names of strangers, signed the records of trade boats that slipped down the Euphrates with copper, obsidian, and lapis. It climbed temple stairs and listened to hymns. It sat beside priest administrators as they divided rations for workers digging canals, building terraces, firing bricks. Where water once wrote only in flood and drought, I now wrote in ledgers. Then the ledgers learned to sing. A scribe, reheating an old tablet to soften its surface, pressed more than numbers into me, pressed the first lines of praise. From signs that measured grain came signs that measured grace. I remembered the sky as poem. Names gathered around me: Enki, the deep sweet water; Enlil, lord of wind and storm; Inanna, the morning star, fierce and fertile. The forces people had watched for millennia flood wind, seed became persons who could be thanked and persuaded. Myth, born from pattern, learned to speak in meter. In temple courts, I felt the sandals of singers, and the tread of bulwark workers moving to the drumwork made ritual. Ritual made schedule. The city held its breath as festivals rose with the moon. Clay spouted from kilns in a steady rain, bowls, jars, bricks, tablets. I was being shaped into memory from every side. New cities joined the chorus: Ur, Nippur, Kish, Lega. At Eridu, the shrine that once rested on reed mats had grown into platforms of baked brick, each layer covering the last persons, as generations covered their dead and began again. They wrote dedications into me before setting me in their walls, a quiet plea for endurance. When disputes arose over fields or canals, people searched my shelves for an earlier tablet, what had been promised, weighed, measured. Judgment took root in record. Soon, law and proverb shared the same clay. A farm boundary became a sentence, a boundary for the mind. As script matured, I watched another transformation. Scribes turned their tablets sideways and tightened the strokes. Cuneiform wedge-shaped writing took its canonical form. It could model not only a sheaf of barley, but a syllable, not only a name, but an action. With verbs, time entered the tablet. With time, story. Stories gathered from the mouths of elders and the walls of sanctuaries. Flood tales, city foundations, the destinies of kings, the fierce compassion of gods, these too, pressed their weight into me. If a king asked, "Who am I without the wall?" the clay answered with architecture and song. Beyond my southern plains, other waters learned the same spell. Along the Nile, where the desert tightens the river like a string on a bow, I wore a different face. Not tablets, but stalks of papyrus split into sheets light as breath. Swift as waterfowl carried marks, shaped like the things they stood for: birds and hands, reeds and suns that could speak a royal name. A palette of soot and ochre replaced the stylus. Brushes whispered where reeds once bit. Yet the logic was the same. The world remembered itself through line and sin. In valley after valley, people learned that memory could be molded or painted, sealed or rolled. Cylinder seals, tiny masterworks of reverse relief rolled across wet clay to leave scenes of banquets, hunts, and prayers. They were signatures and stories, locks and keys, art and identity in a single turn. Where river met sea, I began to think of distance. Trade caravans carried my marks beyond the horizon. Signs born in the delta of Sumer arrived in the Levant and Anatolia. Other scripts sprouted in parallel soils. In every place, the same revelation: counting lead to naming, naming lead to telling, telling lead to meaning. I had spoken in stone for ages. Now, for the first time, I spoke in sentences. But the price of permanence is attention. Scribes learned that to remember everything is to lose the thread. They invented order columns, headings, ruled margins. Lists turned to ledgers, ledgers to literature. From inventories of fish came catalogs of stars. From star lists came calendars that braided sky to field. In every script in school, a lesson returned. To write was to choose. And to choose was to declare what mattered. So humans began to write not only what they had, but who they were. The reed's shadow lengthened across my wet surface. In that shadow, empires would one day stand. In that shadow, a single human voice would say, "Let me be remembered." I, the earth, had learned to remember with them, in clay and ink, in wedge and bird, in every mark that held back forgetting. And memory, given a tongue, prepared itself to become history. I am the earth. I remember, and because I remember, you do too. This is only the first light of civilization. I will remember what came after the temples, the rise of cities, kings, and myths that still shape you. Walk with me, as we follow the echoes of humanity through time. Echoes of Sapiens. If stories like this remind you what it means to be human, subscribe, and keep exploring with us.